Hello, and welcome to Same Crime, Different Time. I'm Jennifer Chambers. You know that I'm passionate about uncovering the truth. Here, we're taking that passion to the dark heart of the Pacific Northwest. As a true crime and historical writer, I've spent years immersed in the chilling archives of this region. Each week, we'll explore cases, both ancient and modern, of murder, unexplained events, strange places, and those who have simply vanished. We'll dig into the research, connecting the dots between past and present, revealing the threads of mystery that weave through our incredible, yet often unsettling, landscape. Prepare to be captivated as we discover that while times may change, the darkest aspects of human nature remain hauntingly the same. This is Same Crime, Different Time, and I'm your host, Jen Chambers. Today, the man called Lyle Stevik. The suicide, the silence, and the DNA trail that finally led home. A content warning, today we do speak about a man who ends his own life. If that is sensitive for you, please take care. September 2001. America is holding its breath. The news is a constant loop of smoke and fear and missing faces and grief. Airports are silent. Small towns feel even smaller, and everyone seems to be looking over their shoulder. And in the middle of that uneasy time, a quiet young man stepped off a bus in rural Washington state, carrying almost nothing. He had no luggage, no identification, and no explanation. He checked into a small motel near the rain-soaked forests of the Olympic Peninsula under the name Lyle Stevik. But it wasn't his real name. 2 days later, the motel staff found him dead in his room. For nearly 17 years, nobody knew who he was. Not the police, not the sleuths that combed the internet, not the thousands of people who became obsessed with the mystery online. And maybe the most haunting thing of all was that no one seemed to be looking for him. Today's episode is all about the strange, heartbreaking case of the man who is known as Lyle Stevik, the clues he left behind, the mystery that was built around his identity, and the groundbreaking use of genetic genealogy and GED match that finally gave him his name back. I've said before, I'm so pleased when I can report these cases that finally get a name. But first, the mystery. And with so many mysteries, solving the case only opened deeper questions. Part 1. The Quinault Inn. Amanda Park, Washington, is the kind of place where fog hangs low over the trees, and the roads seem to disappear into the endless forest. A lot of places here in the Northwest are like that. But this town sits near the edge of the Olympic Peninsula, which is, if you've ever seen the pictures, it's isolated, it's absolutely gorgeous. A million colors of green, and often it's drenched in rain, the rainforest part of it. But on Friday, September 14th, 2001, that's when that young man arrived there by bus. Witnesses would later remember him as being quiet, somebody who was reserved and very polite. Some people thought that he might have even been Canadian because of the way that he spoke. But other people thought that, from the reporting I read, that he seemed nervous or maybe kind of lost in thought, kind of spacey, distracted. And so then he checked into the Quinault Inn using the name Lyle Stevik. And that is Lylestevik. So investigators later discovered that the address he wrote was not real. It belonged to a Best Western hotel in Idaho, actually. And even his name was borrowed and not real. Later on, researchers would connect that name to a character named Lyle Stevik, spelled the same way, from a novel called You Must Remember This by Joyce Carol Oates. It came out in 1987. And that character actually was associated with suicidal thoughts himself. This detail was so strange. It just kept investigators thinking about it for years and years because it suggested that he planned it. It wasn't impulsive. It wasn't confusion, but it was preparation. Part 2, the room. At the Kennel Inn, the clerk at the motel first placed him in room number 8. But later, he asked to move and change rooms. There was some noise outside. And so they reassigned him to room 5. This was a big part of the mystery, and this small decision would become one of those details that was repeated in all kinds of... There's a million documentaries about him, Reddit threads, and discussions online that kind of kept going for the next 20 years. Because once he entered room 5, he never left alive. On September 17th, housekeeping entered his room, and they discovered his body inside the closet. He had died by suicide by hanging using his belt. Investigators noted there were several details that were really strange. The blinds were closed. Pillows had been placed around the inside of the closet. He left cash that was arranged on the table. It was just enough to pay for the room. And there was a note, but it just read the word suicide. Police also said that they found another paper in the trash where he or someone practiced writing the word suicide. But the strangest part was that he had almost no belongings. He just had a toothbrush, toothpaste, and the clothes that he was wearing. There wasn't any wallet or pictures. There was no letters or keys or clues. It was like whoever he was, he'd completely erased himself before he arrived. Part 3, building the profile. His autopsy painted an incomplete picture. The man known as Lyle Stevik, they estimated between 20 and 35 years old. He had dark hair, he had green eyes, and there was evidence of previous orthodontic work. There was also some evidence that he'd recently lost a significant amount of weight, possibly as much as 40 pounds, they estimated. They recovered fingerprints and dental records and DNA, and normally one of those would have led somewhere, but nothing did. No missing person report ever matched him, no fingerprint database identified him at that time, and no dental records were connected to him. They created a picture of him that went around to law enforcement agencies. He had a pretty square-shaped face. He was close-shaven. He wasn't really anything remarkable, right? But the fact that nothing connected to him became really central to the mystery. How did he disappear so completely? So online, everybody became immediately fascinated by the case and continued to be. People thought that maybe he was fleeing abuse, or maybe he was terminally ill, or maybe he was vanishing on purpose just so that he could die anonymously, or maybe it was he was escaping from the law. And others wondered whether the timing mattered, because he did arrive just days after the September 11th attacks. And some people theorized that the national trauma may have influenced his mental state. There wasn't ever any evidence that directly linked the two, but I remember that time. And people were worried about all different kinds of connections with September 11th. So, I don't know. I think it's interesting to note. But over time, he just became one of the internet's best-known unidentified people. Not because of the violence itself, but because of the loneliness and the absolute unknown of who this man was. So part 4, the internet sleuths. So by the mid-2000s, online forums and people who are amateur investigators adopted his case. It was like a mission. There was blogs and there were communities. There's a lot of unidentified persons communities. I've looked at those with my research too. Reddit users and stuff like that. They talked about every single detail. The way that his name was spelled, possible connotations of his accent, the handwriting of the note, the clothing he was wearing, everything humanized him. This young man was alive, so alive, but then just seemed determined to disappear and become anonymous, but also unforgettable. And then it also, interestingly, I saw a bunch of things that raise some ethical questions. If someone chooses to be anonymous in death, should people try to undo that? Eventually, science outran the mystery, and the debate became more heated both ways. Part 5, GED match and genetic genealogy. So the way that GED match works, it's really interesting. It goes, the crime scene DNA is collected, which goes into a public DNA database. You then find close matches. You form distinct clusters from the match list. You build family trees for each of those matches, and then find a common ancestor. And then you research each cluster and all of their descendants, and then find the place where the clusters meet, and then focus on the descendants of the people where it met, and then filter and go through all these potential suspects, and then provide that list to law enforcement, and then the law enforcement does the actual investigation. So it's a very long process. So in 2018, the DNA Doe Project took on this case. And this was during the early part of forensic genetic genealogy. This whole technique was what helped identify the Golden State Killer, right? So instead of searching for an exact DNA in criminal databases, places like CODIS, they use that profile, and then using that system that I just explained, they go to this public genealogy website, GED Match, where users voluntarily share ancestry results. And that changed everything. Because rather than searching for him himself, they were able to search for relatives. Second cousins, third cousins, tiny branches. Genealogists Colleen Fitzpatrick and Margaret Press began tracing connections that appeared tied to families in New Mexico and California. And eventually they found his biological family, and then came one of the saddest things of the entire case. His family believed that he had voluntarily estranged himself. They thought that he was alive somewhere, and just didn't want to be contacted. So they never filed a missing persons report. That's why. I can hardly bear to imagine that for nearly 17 years, they thought that he'd chosen to be apart while all these investigators searched for this man who didn't have a name. Part 6, identified. The Grays County Harbor Sheriff's Office announced that Lyle Stevik had finally been identified in May of 2018, but they didn't release his real name. His family had requested privacy, and law enforcement did honor that request. I mean, that frustrated some people on the internet. Other people defended it. But underneath that, it's a real human being. This wasn't a puzzle. This was a person who died alone. The sheriff's office confirmed that he was 25, and originally he had come from Alameda County, California. And this is another incredibly sad detail. They confirmed his identity using fingerprints taken during a childhood school identification program. The fingerprints when he was a child. They matched him nearly 20 years later. That's so devastating. Part 7, the bigger questions. This case became important for reasons beyond the mystery. It talked about how many unidentified people aren't actually reported missing for lots of reasons, and how things like estrangement can change investigations. But before GED match and forensic genealogy, this might have never been solved, ever. But countless unidentified persons cases are being reopened because of the same techniques. And that does leave behind some questions. What obligation do we have to identify these people? Does anonymity deserve protection? I think in this case, the family chose to preserve that. And I personally think that was the right thing to do. But also, I can see the other side. It depends on the case, I think. But Lyle Stevik's real name exists now, and that's the important part, is that his family was able to find out. The saddest part, besides his death and his estrangement from his family, there's, like I said, there's so many sad parts, is that his life story disappeared with him. Some of these cases end with arrests, and some end with confessions, and some end quietly, with a single press release and a family asking for privacy. All those places still exist, but I think it's really important that amidst of all the silence in the Olympic Peninsula, the memory of that young man who arrived carrying almost nothing, except his name, which was secret, wasn't unheralded in the end. His family was able to find some closure there. I hope that for all the cases that we cover, all the missing persons cases. Thank you very much for listening today. Our sources today include the Grays Harbor County Sheriff's Office press releases, DNA Doe Project case summaries, GED Match Forensic Genealogy. I used some paperwork to understand the methodology, the Doe Network Case Archive. There's a ton of other resources. You must remember this. Articles from the Aberdeen Washington newspaper, the Daily World. I also would recommend that if you're interested in this, think about the ethics of identifying anonymous decedents and genetic genealogy and privacy. It's changing all the time. I think it's fascinating. It's fascinating. And I personally think it's a really good thing that we're able to identify all these people. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you tune in again next week for another case. Stay safe out there.